When the Legends Die, Chapter 43. They headed west on the highway. Woodward asked only a few questions, and Tom gave short answers. I've been back east. Broken leg. They pinned it, and it's all right now to walk on, the doctor says. I'm Ute, not Navajo. Tom asked questions, and Woodward said the home ranch was in the San Luis Valley over near San Tonito. He ran 12 to 15,000 head of sheep, parceled them out in flocks of 2,000 head or so, and sent them into the high country for summer range. Fed out his own lambs in the fall, wintered his ewes on the home ranch. He had 3 flocks between Pagosa and Durango. Trailed them out in the summer range, back in the fall. My supply man makes the rounds once a week. If a good herder wants to stay on, I've got work for him in the home ranch all winter. If you know that horse mountain country, you'll make out. Only for God's sakes, if you got to shoot yourself, do it in the head and make a clean job of it. Woodward laughed wryly. God, how gangrene stinks. Just like fly-blown sheep carcass. At Piedratown, they turned north, up the river and into the hills, following a track that couldn't even be called a wagon trail. Woodward was so busy driving he had no time to talk. The track crossed the Chateau Piedra half a dozen times and zigzagged up the valley, much of the way slow going for the pickup. Remembering his own trips up and down the valley long ago, Tom thought they made incredibly fast time. Before he could believe it, they were at the foot of Horse Mountain, making their way around it. Then they climbed a sharp slope, topped out on a flat shoulder, and came to a big natural meadow edged half a mile away by aspens and scattered pines. The flock was grazing at the far edge, and this side of the timber. The herder wasn't in sight, but a saddle horse lifted its head from grazing and watched them. Woodward drove past a gray pyramid tent toward a small creek, gave it a nod, and drove slowly out across the meadow toward the sheep. A man got to his feet, waved, and 2 dogs barked. The man walked toward them, and Woodward drew up beside them. Dave, Woodward shouted above the roar of the motor, this is Tom. He's going to take the flock. Come on in and show him where things are, and we'll head for home. Dave nodded to Tom. He was a tall, sinewy farm boy in his late 20s. He went to catch up the saddle horse, and Woodward drove slowly along the edge of the flock, appraising, then turned and drove back to the tent. They got out, and Tom saw that Dave kept a neat camp. The Dutch oven beside the flat stones at the cooking fireplace was clean. The coffee pot was airing, and the skillet had been scoured. Dave rode up, the dogs with him, and showed Tom the tin-covered grub box, the cooler in the creek with meat and butter, the kerosene can for the lantern. He flipped open the tent flaps, pointed to the blankets neatly drawn up on the folding canvas cot. No bugs. Anything I hate, it's a lousy bed. I finally got them all cleaned out. He turned to the dogs. Shep and Spot know the hand signals. Good dogs. And old Mac, nodding towards the bay gelding, is a lazy old plug, but he doesn't wander. You don't have to hobble him. Woodward was getting restless. He handed Tom his clothes bag from the pickup, then picked up the boxes of 30-30 shells. Almost forgot these. You may need them. Dave nodded. There's a bear or 2 around here. I haven't seen one, but Manuel said he did. The rifle's in the saddle boot. She sighted in at 100 yards and shoots good and flat. He, too, was eager to be off. That's about cover things? I think so. Dave and Woodward got into the truck. Anything comes up, ask Charlie, the supply man. He'll be around Thursday, Woodward said. Or is it Wednesday up here, Dave? Thursday. Woodward was gunning the motor. Good luck, Dave shouted as Woodward swung the pickup around, headed toward the valley. Tom watched them get out of sight, heard the motor a few minutes longer, then just stood and listened to the silence. It was unbelievable. He had forgotten. Then he heard the burbling of the creek, the whispering of the aspens just across the creek, but those sounds were like a part of the silence, the peace. One of the dogs nosed his hand. He rubbed its ears, then looked at the flock beginning to loosen up, scattered into the edge of the timber. He ordered the dogs to go pull the flock together. They were baffled by his words. Without thinking, he remembered the hand signals Albert Left Hand used, made them, and the dogs raced across the meadow toward the sheep. He looked at the saddle horse, was tempted to mount and follow the dogs, but decided against riding. He walked, leading the horse, and the grass underfoot felt strangely soft. It had been a long time since he walked on grass. His legs were stiff, and his hips were sore from the pickup ride, but he walked all the way to the flock. The dogs had pulled them together again. He looped the reins loosely over the saddle horn, let the horse graze, and sat down to rest. He was breathing fast, unused to the thin air. It would take a few days to get acclimated again. He sat, savoring the pine-scented air, resting his eyes on the nearby green, the distant blue. Then he looked at his Levi's, still new and stiff, and at his plain work boots, and knew he was an outlander, a stranger. He heard the lambs bleating for their mother, ewes blading their answer, and he smiled at the irony. He had come west to rest, to start over, but he hadn't expected to go all the way back to his beginning. He was a sheep herder again, right back where he started. He plucked a blade of grass, chewed it, watched the sheep, and welcomed the warmth of the sun on his back. Mid-afternoons passed, and the sun began to slip down toward the peaks to the west. The sheep were working back across the meadow toward the creek. When the long shadows reached him, he caught the horse, reached for the stirrup, and swung into the saddle without thinking. Then he felt a twinge in his right leg and an ache across his hips, but there was no real pain. He reined the horse around toward the sheep, thinking it had been almost 2 months since he had been in a saddle, years since he'd been on a gentle horse. He rode along the edge of the flock, the horse at a walk, following the sheep toward the creek. They took their time, and when they reached the water, they scattered along it and drank their fill, then turned back onto the grass. They would graze for another hour, until late dusk, before they bedded down. He rode over to his camp, unsaddled the horse, and hung the saddle from a rope over a low branch of a pine near the tent to keep it out of the reach of porcupines. He built a fire, opened a can of beans, and set them to heat in the frying pan, made a pot of coffee. By the time he had eaten and fed the dogs, the sheep had bedded down, and the first stars were out. He washed his dishes, put them away, and went with the dogs for a slow walk around the flock. The stars glinted, the air was cool, the aspens whispered to the night. The sheep were quiet. He went back to the fire, poured another tin cup of coffee, and sat sipping it, watching the embers darken and die. He sat for another half-hour before the chill deepened the aches in his tired muscles and complaining joints. He got up, tempted to bring out a blanket and roll up in it under the stars, the night close around him, but he knew that was foolish. He went into the tent, undressed in the dark, got into bed, and was asleep in 5 minutes. It was dawn when he wakened. He pushed back the blankets, pulled on his pants and his boots, went outside. The dog, sleeping, curled up beside the stones of the fireplace, stretched and yawned and whined a greeting. He went to the creek, washed in the icy water, and noticed the night's dew dripping from the bushes. He had forgotten how wet everything was in a mountain dawn, and how chilly. He filled the coffee pot, built a fire, set bacon to fry. The sheep had begun to leave their bed ground. They would graze contentedly where they were for another hour. He had a first cup of coffee, then he mixed batter and fried pancakes in bacon grease. He fed the dogs and ate his own breakfast. And the sun came up over the range to the east and shimmered the morning mist that hung over the meadow. Jays began to scream, and one came close to the fire, expecting a handout. He tossed it a piece of pancake. A long-tailed magpie scolded but didn't come near. He fried the last of the batter in one big cake, flipped it onto the stones to cool for the birds and the chipmunks. When he had washed his dishes, he got the pack of stew meat from the cooler and set it to cook with onions and potatoes in the Dutch oven. By the time he had made his bed, old Mac came up, expecting to be saddled. Tom obliged him, mounted, called the dogs, and went out to gather the sheep, which had scattered all over the meadow. Once they were bunched, he rode a slow circle of the meadow, orienting himself. He couldn't remember ever being here, in this particular meadow, though he was sure he had been in the valley just below. On the way up in the pickup, he had seen a dozen places that looked familiar, but distances were distorted. The pickup at its slowest, traveling 2 or 3 times as fast as a man would on foot. He was sure there were other places he would recognize once he let the layers of time slip off. Time, he thought, was like the onions he had just peeled, layer on layer, and to get down to the heart of things, you let the layers peel off one by one. He circled the meadow, finding hidden gaps among the trees that led to other, smaller meadows, which he marked in his mind to graze when the sheep had grazed down the big meadow. Then he came to a place where the timbered slope fell away steeply and a wide vista opened to the north and the west. The mountains stood in deceptive ranks, scattered out looking like successive ranges, each with its own degree of shadow and distance. Two peaks well apart loomed above the others, the gray bulk of one perhaps 15 miles to the northwest, the bald upthrust of the other half again as far directly north. He smiled, recognizing them, Granite Peak, the closer one, to the northwest, and Bald Mountain to the north. He sat in the saddle a long time, just looking. Then he rode back to the flock, sat in the grass, let the horse graze, and felt another layer of time slowly peeling off. Noon, the sun overhead, and he walked back to camp and ate a plateful of stew, and all afternoon he sat in the sun or walked and let the peace and silence soak into him. Evening, supper, a last walk around the bedded flock. Eat and sleep and walk, Dr. Ferguson had ordered. Remembering, he smiled. There wasn't much else for a sheepherder to do, even if he wanted to.